All right. So thanks for everyone for joining. I'm just going to give a quick presentation on UX, microinteraction, and framer motion. So basically, this is going to be, I guess, kind of split in the first half, kind of explaining what microinteractions are, and I guess trying to convince you guys of why they're important and how we should care about them and try to do them.
I don't think they can hear you. They can't. Yeah, they can't.
Is this working?
How about now?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Cool. Let's start again. This is going to be a presentation on microinteractions and framer motion. So basically, I'm going to cover in the first half kind of what microinteractions are, why they're important, and trying to convince you guys of why we should kind of think about them when we develop. And then I'm going to cover, I guess, the library framer motion, which is a library I found super useful to essentially make animations so that you don't have to faff around with the CSS and make it very complicated. So just to start, I guess, in terms of definitions, what are microinteractions? So they can be defined as small, preferably functional animation that support the user by giving visual feedback and displaying changes more clearly. So what we actually kind of mean by that and is kind of anything that is subtle and small. So we don't really mean large, big animations all across your website. When we talk about microinteraction, it's more like those little changes that you might not even notice. And usually a good rule is that you shouldn't even notice them until they're not there, in which case they would make your user experience a bit worse and you would notice the lack of it, I guess. So as I said, there are animations, and usually they give visual feedback. So usually there will be things that tell the user essentially what's going on in the website. So they can explain, they can either be as feedback to actions that the user did, or they can be feedbacks to the general state of the website. So I guess an example of sometimes bad things that could happen if you don't have them is a user clicks a button, the connection is low, or there's a bug or something, and the button doesn't really do anything, or doesn't do anything for a while, and the user doesn't really know whether the button has been clicked or acknowledged in the first place, and then he's just a bit confused. He might click it again, or he might just get annoyed and just leave the website. Generally speaking, also, microinteractions don't necessarily have to be only this. There can be also sounds and a bunch of other things, but I guess for this presentation, I'll just consider the visual animations. So there's lots of types. An example, I just kind of listed some kinds of them. So usually they happen if you click, if you hover, if you swipe, if you have state changes, error animations. And some examples, I guess, they can be stuff like this. So kind of cool little animation that kind of give a bit of, I guess, life to the website. They can be if you add stuff to the cart, just kind of stuff like that. Or they can be, I guess, more probably useful or common stuff for in forms. I guess how do we tell the user the state of the form and whether there's errors and where the errors comes from and stuff. Or they can be, like I said, not necessarily coming from user triggers and actions. They can come from the state, the general state of the application. So for example, if someone is texting you back, you could see an animation of someone typing, and I guess that kind of keeps the user engaged, and that's why it's important, because then the user will not leave the app, he will stay because he knows someone is typing back. And yeah, briefly, I guess, why do we need them? So there's something called the pyramid of user needs, which kind of explains what the user is looking for and what he needs in order to use a product and keep using it, which at the end of the day is, I guess, what we want him to do, or her. So at the bottom, we just have functional. So this essentially means that the product solves a business problem or a need that he has. So I don't know, you don't want to look for flights in lots of different apps. So you might have an app that search for you for all the different flights and essentially answers to a need, I guess. Second one is reliable. So this is, by the way, this pyramid is for any sort of product. So for example, if you buy a car, you want the car to work nicely, but you also want it to be reliable and not break down. So for us, I guess, not have bugs, stuff like that. Then you want it to be usable. So this is easy to use. You might have a website that is does both of these things, but then it's just not intuitive on how to use it. Or if you want to go to a certain page, you have to click 10 times to navigate to it. And then pleasurable is I guess what we're interested in when we talk about microinteractions, which is, does the user enjoy using the website, essentially? Does he find it like not necessarily fun, but like is it essentially not a pain? And because it's at the top, usually we can say, oh, it's just kind of like that little thing that I guess we just build MVPs we don't really care about, which to an extent is like kind of true. You don't want to like start focusing on all these design things if you have bugs or it's not functional. But just even looking at the pyramid, it is a thing at the top, and it is what kind of like will make your website stand out, especially if you are like, nowadays there's lots of websites, many kind of do very similar things, and you need to make sure that yours is like stands out and will be liked by your users over others, for example. And having these little like engagement, making their user experience better is one way to do it. So yeah, I guess before we jump into kind of like how we build them with the code, just usually a general microinteraction, how it works is that there's a trigger, and this is I guess kind of like useful when we look at frame motion later. So there's a trigger. This is going to be, as we said, either a user action or like a system action. Then there is a set of rules. So for example, the user clicks send in the form, and then there's a bunch of rules to see whether the form is like valid or invalid. And then there's a feedback, which is the actual animation that we want to use to tell the user, hey, this has been acknowledged, this is the response to your action, I guess. And finally, there is sometimes loops and modes if you want an animation to keep happening, every 30 minutes, like, snoozing an alarm or something. I guess if there is some sort of repetition, this can be taken care of. So I guess in terms of the code itself, I guess what we would normally do is, I guess we would use CSS Animations to make these kind of like changes and these like movements in the website. So with CSS Animations, what we have is that we have a div, we give it some styling, and then we have to give it an animation, for example, an animation name, and then a duration or some other parameters. And then later, we need to define this animation. In this case, it's called example. And then we have to say, okay, for this animation, I want the background color to change over these 4 seconds from red to yellow to blue to green at equal times, throughout these 4 seconds. And this is generally how you do them. And there are some problems to this. The main ones is that there's a lot of code. Here it may not necessarily seem like it, but once you have to like touch, colors, shapes, opacity, like positions, it becomes like a lot of code. And especially once you have to you may not just have one animation, but you may have like lots of animations. And as soon as you start adding animation, you start having lots of keyframes, and it becomes like a bit of a mess. So it's a bit hard to read. It's hard to read and debug. You're gonna have essentially a div with potentially many animations, but then the animations are all like written elsewhere, like down in the keyframe, and then you're just gonna end up with like loads of blocks of keyframes that define different things, and it's quite hard to keep track of. It's separate from the TypeScript, so just that it means that, you're gonna code your component, and then all of these animations, which are kind of like, sometimes they become kind of like relevant to the logic of the actual component. It's not just like styling. It's, like, oh, if I click this, then I want this to happen. And so there's just this separation that makes it a bit harder to write and maintain. As I said, it's harder to do user system and trigger. So we can give it an animation, like, oh, if it loads, I want the div to have this animation. But if I want to trigger this animation, like, at this specific time, when this specific thing happens, it just becomes a bit hard. Then you have to like maybe change the class, and which leads me to the second point. You start having lots of classes, and each class corresponds to a different type of animation, but usually you want like all of these animations to be called at different times. What else? Sometimes if you have an animation like sliding to the right and then sliding up, then you need to start having delays. Like, you want this animation to happen after X seconds, and then you need a bunch of delays, and then if you change one delay, then you need to remember to change the others or make some variables. And finally, I guess again, because it's separate from the TypeScript, you can pass props. So if you have anything related to like props of your component, it just becomes quite tricky to do. So this is where frame motion comes into, I guess, place to help us. So quickly, I guess there's 2 ways usually you can use it. One is like, I'll show both. One is like a very simple way, and then I'll show how it solves some of the problems, but not all. And then I'll show the kind of more, like, not complex, but like the more full way in which you can just like, you're able to do pretty much everything. So the first one is just to import frame of motion, and then instead of using the HTML tags like a div, you just use motion div, and that automatically adds all the props. So you can say animate, and you can give it a background color from red, yellow, blue, green. And this is essentially the same thing that we had in the other code, is just with one line. And if we want to, on top of it, maybe change the duration or the times and repetition and stuff, then again, we can just do it in just one single line, and we can say, I want it to last 3 seconds. And I guess the times is kind of like the keyframes. If you don't want it to be 0, 0.25, 5, you can just space them differently. So you can have all that kind of like logic just in one line, very simply. And then on top of it, you can also add a bunch of things for kind of like very common triggers. For example, like if you tap, that's like a trigger that you will often have. Like if while I'm clicking something, I want something to happen. So you can say, while I click something, I want it to shrink a little bit. And you have a bunch of others like common like triggers that you can use. So on tap, like hover, pan, while entering view. Actually, the while entering view is quite useful if you have like a page where you scroll, and as you scroll, you want stuff to like pop up easily, like nicely, I guess. Then you can just say while they enter the viewport, then you want this animation, and then you can just do it essentially in one line, and then you just pass in an object saying what you want the animation to be. So let's see what the benefits of this are. So the first one is that there is less code. So as we saw, like if you just wanted that simple thing, it can just be done in one line. It's easier to read because everything is just there. It's just like close to where you want it to happen. So you're editing the div, and the animation is just very close to the div, so it's easy to read. It's in the TypeScript, so that doesn't mean, it means you won't have to like shift around a bunch of stuff. You can pass props because, again, it's in TypeScript. If you have a prop with a color, you can just pass it. And I put in kind of in yellow the user system triggers. It's a little bit easier to handle because I guess if you want to use the tap, the hover, the viewport and stuff, that's quite easy. But if you want to do something like, if as you're typing a form, while you press the last like letter of the form, then you want something to happen, then you still can't really do it with the simple way of, I guess, of using frame of motion. But still, like even just this makes the standard animation just like easier to write and easier to like deal with. And if we want to go one step further and have like full control of everything, then we need to use variants. So variants essentially means that you still have your motion div, just like you had before, but then instead of giving it like this anime and these props, you just pass it the variants, and then you say what the initial one is. So now your motion div will know about all these types of variants. So for example, it will know what the hidden is. Hidden is opacity 0. It will know what expand is. It will know if there is an error, like what the error state is, which is like red. It will know what the success state is, green. So now your motion div is like fully aware of all these things, and all you need to do is kind of like set them whenever you want. So if you want to set them on load, then you just say initial hidden, for example. And if you want to set them separately, then you can use hooks. So for example, there's a use animation hook, which is used to pass it to the animate. And now if, for example, on the form, you want to do a bunch of stuff, you can use this function. You can create a function. Here I said like handle animation. And you can say, okay, now I want the control to start. I want it to become visible. Then I want it to expand. And then I want it to go in success or error. So essentially, because you can create your own functions, you can trigger them whenever you want, and you can animate your div however you like, essentially. And the other nice thing that we'll see is, I guess, first of all, it becomes easier to manage the user triggers and system triggers, because you just have a function. Whenever you would call that function in your code, that logic, you can just call that one, and that will animate your div. It also, I don't know if you saw, but the animate takes like, you can call the animate with, the use animation hook output, your control, can handle like asynchronous function. So that means if you want it to become visible and then expand, you don't need to use delays. You can just await So you can just await the visible so that it becomes visible. And then because you're awaiting, then it will wait for that, and then it will be expand. So essentially, you don't have to start worrying about kind of like delays anymore, and you can just do everything kind of like synchronously. And yeah, and it essentially means that you don't need to have lots of classes anymore, because you just have the variants, you define them at the top of your file, and then your variants will just be the source of truth of where everything is like defined. So it makes it very nice and simple. That is kind of it. I guess for questions, I'll show you guys like 2 animations that I just did using it, which are kind of simple. So the first one is kind of like a simple one where like a button, I think it's a bit slow. Well, it's a bit smoother in my laptop, but, but essentially it drops, it like wiggles a little bit, and then, you know, if you hover, it does a bunch of things, and then if you click it, you can change the color. Like, this is kind of a simple one. And then a more complicated one could be like a payment form. So also the thing you can do, you can animate like SVGs. So you can actually just create any shape that you want. And also, I cover kind of like the basic, but there's a whole list of like hooks that are like really cool if you want to do like more complicated things. So for example, there's a hook to like drag things and check the position. So if I change the position, you can see that I'm changing the color as I drag it. Like in my laptop again, it's smooth, but yeah. And then you can just like enter a bunch of stuff. You can like animate it like this, you can make it shake, and then, as I said, because you have SVG, you can just like do any animation that you want. So yeah, I guess it makes this kind of simple to do, which with CSS, it would just be kind of painful. Any questions?
You showed motion adopted. Is there other?
Yeah, it has. It has, I don't have a full list, but it has most of the HTML tags. It has div, like list, most of them.
Like style components, like your own custom component, and then animate that.
Probably not. I guess maybe not too sure. I guess when I was doing it, if I need any styling, I was using like CSS. Because you can still give it like on top of those specific ones, all your CSS styling that you want. I guess if you have styling component, then you have your custom component. I'm not too sure about that, but yeah.
Sorry, everyone.
I'm assuming it's not a thing in React Native.
No. Yeah.
Have you noticed any like performance issues when adding things like this?
Usually only when you share the screen. So that's kind of it. No, I think, yeah, it's been like really smooth. And I think that one of the, to be fair, the coolest feature that I guess I didn't explain, which is a bit unrelated maybe to micro interaction, is just the drag and drop. Like I use I think it's like React DND is another library I use for, like this one makes, it's like so much easier. I mean, I guess maybe it's a bit more limited, but like you just literally say draggable, and then it's automatically draggable. And then if you want extra thing, you can just define props of like bounding and stuff. And it's really smooth while you do it. I guess the only thing about performance that you may want to be wary of is it's a big package. So if you download it, it's quite chunky. If you want to restrict your bundle size, this may be something to consider. But otherwise, I think it's fine.
How long did it take you to make the animations that you showed us?
The first one, like 10 minutes, it's like 15 minutes. It's just like a bunch of variants, which is like hidden, go down, expand, shake, and then I just add like on click 2 variants. The other one, like, I don't know, a bit more, but I was just kind of like playing with it. I was just like seeing how I can make it, but yeah. But also those are not even micro interaction at that point. Those are just, I just wanted to show, I guess, like how you can make complex things as well as like small changes, yeah.
How does it handle multi-triggers? So imagine somebody has decided to do a whole bunch of different triggers at the same time, like click, do an anchor, etc. Does it sequence them? So it says like it handles them one at a time, or does it have basically like a timer where it won't accept any more inputs until it's completed the animation?
I don't know. I don't think there's any timer like that. I think if you call it, it would just be called. It would just be triggered.
So for example, if someone were to like click it 100 times, would it just do the animation once and like ignore the rest of the clicks while?
I would have to try it. I'm not sure.
You can try it.
Try it on your one.
Oh, I need. I wrote it. I wrote it a while ago. I don't want to. I'll let you know though. Oh, as in literally try it here. You meant?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant like change the code right now. As in like.
You click it multiple times.
Yeah. So well, you'd have to come here to see. It's just going from red to green all the time.
Okay, so it looks like is it pausing the animation and like restarting it from each click? So that if you click it once, maybe it's
You won't be able to see it there.
Does it complete the animation?
Yeah. Is it cancelling the animation?
Is it canceling?
Because the other one is applying the same thing, because the new one is applying the color.
Yeah, so it's like pausing and restarting
Yeah, but if I don't know, say there was a random animation, the first one would like make it bigger and the second one would change color, it wouldn't cancel it getting bigger. It's just because now I'm editing the same property that it is canceling it, I guess. Yeah.
So when
Some
you're
questions?
using these, like implementing these animations, these microinteractions, are they coming from your designers? Or are you thinking about these on your own? You're like, oh, this would be cool. In your project, how has it worked?
This doesn't come from my projects. I don't necessarily know, but I would assume probably what they would have to be dealt with the designer. I think it's quite easy otherwise for you to be like, oh, I want to add this cool thing, and then the designer's like, well, what the hell, no. Especially because one thing that is like that you usually have to think about is like you want to add a few, but you don't want to add too many, because if you add too many, then it just defeats the whole purpose. Like usually it's like either to give like specific things about like, oh, like nice feedbacks that you want the user to be aware of, or to like draw attention to something specific, like a call to action. If you just start spamming it, then it just becomes like redundant. So I guess it's something that the designer would have to probably make a choice. But I guess you knowing what you can do and how easily you can do it gives you like the liberty of like maybe suggesting things or stuff like that. Yeah. Nope. One more.
I was curious as to like how this works under the hood. Maybe, I don't know if you know, like does it compile it down to native CSS animations?
I would assume so, but I don't know. I'd assume it does, but I can't be sure. Yeah.